You remember we went through a controversial section 2 weeks ago when we met on a Wednesday evening in Hebrews chapter 6. And I know that in this group that I'm teaching, that there are people on both sides of the discussion, people on both sides of the debate. When it comes to the subject, can a Christian lose their salvation? And most of you also know through all my teachings, all the times that I've shared and discussed this subject with you, sometimes even personally, that I'm a firm believer that once you receive eternal life, the gift of salvation, that you can never lose it. That is, if you've truly received the gift of salvation. But just for a brief moment, I want to address those who hold the view that salvation can be lost. If you are one of them, when you believe that there is a chance, a possibility that a person can lose their salvation, and are a bit worried that I may be misleading others, that salvation can never be lost, and you're wondering, is that the wrong teaching? Will that do any damage? I want to address that. And I want us to all think of this, and I've said this quite often as well. Whatever position you take, sorry, my screen suddenly minimized. I don't know why. Can't see myself. Just give me a minute, please. Okay, so whatever position you take on this subject, whether you're somebody who says salvation can be lost, whether you say salvation cannot be lost, think about it from a practical standpoint. Think about it from a practical standpoint. It is my contention that from a practical standpoint, it makes little difference what position you take, either this side or that side. Take, for example, a man who comes into the church and he gets saved and he shows some fruit. And then after a year, he walks away from the faith. If you believe that salvation can be lost, you would go up to him and say, you lost your salvation. You were saved, you lost your salvation, get saved again. That would be your counsel to him. That would be your advice to him. That would be your ministry to him. Guess what my counsel would be to him? I would say, you were never saved to begin with. You dabbled with Christianity, but you never came fully and finally get truly saved. So one person, so both of us, it's a very similar outcome if you think of it. One person will say get saved again, I will say get truly saved. That's the only difference. Now, of course, that's in terms of practical ministry to a person. But what about the teaching itself? Isn't it damaging? If somebody's wondering, isn't it damaging to teach that you can never lose your salvation? Very honestly, I'll admit, if that was the only teaching that was around, it might have been damaging. If everybody said salvation can never be lost, then it might be quite damaging. Surely there'll be many people who say, I believe in Jesus. I made a confession 20 years ago. I can live any way that I want to live. I've got my ticket to heaven. And that's why, as I said before, and some others have said it as well, God, in His sovereignty or wisdom, I believe, has allowed this tension to exist in both, people, good, sound, biblical people on both sides of this debate. Now, again, in the same vein, in the same breath, I say if that was the only teaching that exists, I mean, even if you take the flip side of it, that everybody was on the same page, everybody said salvation can be lost, then that would also lead to another extreme where Christians would be petrified. There'll be many people who have these irrational fears and they say, I don't know if I've lost my salvation. I don't know I sin. It will end up there. That's why I believe God has allowed this tension to exist. Of course, personally, I believe the more weightier position through scripture is that salvation cannot be lost. Of course, there'll be somebody else who says the opposite. They believe the weightier position is that salvation can be lost. And again, as a joke, I just say tongue in cheek, everybody has the right to be wrong. But I conclude that both sides should be allowed to exist. So, I mean, finally, if you ask, is there only one position that is right? Absolutely, there is only one position that is right. Is scripture 100% clear as to which position is right? I don't personally think so. Maybe somebody will say, no, it's right, but I don't know if they're being intellectually honest when it comes to it. I don't think scripture is 100% clear about that. And I believe God has allowed that tension to exist. So, with that as an introduction, let me just get into today's text. And it starts in verse 9 of chapter 6. Just give me a second. I'm looking at one side of the screen because I don't know what happened. Oh, thank you. Okay. Verse 9 of chapter 6 says, though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure of better things, things that belong to salvation. The author is saying, though we speak in this way, if just to refresh our memories, what does he mean when he says, though we speak in this way? What did the author say? We went across that 2 weeks ago. Basically, and this is what I taught 2 weeks ago, basically, some people fail to press on to maturity, and as a result, they face the temporal judgment of God and lose rewards in eternity. Now, just to refresh your memories, look at verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 6. Even if you don't have it in front of you, I'm reading it right now. It says, the author says, therefore, let us leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and go on to maturity. And then he lists those elementary doctrines. So again, he says, let's leave the elementary doctrine of Christ and press on or go on to maturity. Now look at verse 3. From verse 1, look at verse 3. It says, and this we will do if God permits. We have to ask, what is this that God is going to permit? I think it's abundantly clear that this that God permits is the pressing on to maturity. I don't think we can make any. I think it's really, really clear over there. Verse 1 says, press on to maturity. Leave the elementary doctrines, press on to maturity. Verse 3 says, this we will do. What is it? This pressing on to maturity, if God permits. Why again? I mean, when you think of that Kadesh Barnea incident, God did not permit them to enter that land because they were very discouraged when the spies came back. He did not. They tried to, but then they were chased by their enemies. He did not. Here, the author is saying, this we will do, press on to maturity if God permits. And it's right after that controversial section comes, starting in verse 4 right up to verse 6. But again, if the word for, verse 4, did not start with the word for, we can make the argument that the author is starting some new section. He's going to start he's going to talk about some new category of people. But clearly, he is continuing from the previous section because he uses the word for. That is the connector. He uses the word for. And you might remember again the example of the Israelites that we talked about 2 weeks ago. They were disobedient in the wilderness, but were they still God's covenant people? The answer to that is yes. Did they still receive manna on a daily basis, even though they were disobedient, wandering in the wilderness? The answer is yes. Did their sandals never wear out? The answer is yes, it never wore out. So I mean, you can understand this very simply with even as a parent. You have a child, the child can be good or disobedient. But just because the child is disobedient, the child doesn't stop being your child. Whatever the child does, the child will always be the child of that particular parent. And it's the same way with God. His covenant is not broken. His people, the Israelites, were still his people. They were not very obedient and they lacked faith. They had a lot of unbelief, but they were still his people. And so, because of that, they did not receive their reward at that time, what he had promised them, aka the land of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey. Because of their disobedience, they did not enter, they did not receive the promise that God gave them. They did not enter the promised land. They faced the temporal judgment of God, that is, they wandered for 40 years, and in the wilderness, they wandered for 40 years, and their bodies were strewn all over the desert. But that does not mean that that we can't make the logical inference from that is not that because their bodies were strewn in the wilderness, they all perished in hell. That would be a fallacy. So they died in the wilderness because they faced a temporary judgment of God. Because if we're making that connection that they died in the wilderness, therefore they're all burning in hell right now, then we have to say that Moses is also in hell. And we know that Moses is not in hell. He appeared in Mount of Transfiguration. He probably is one of the two witnesses in Revelation. What about Aaron? What about Miriam the prophetess? What about all the Levites that walked around? Are you saying they all perished in hell just because their bodies were strewn in the rest? I don't think that argument will work. But their faith, you can say their faith was immature. You can say their faith was incomplete. There was a lot of disobedience. Many of them had unbelief in their heart. And you can contrast them with somebody like Caleb. Now, I preached a whole sermon on Caleb in revival, and so he's a wonderful character to preach on. He's a man of endurance, a man. And here's a beautiful summary of him, biblical summary of him. Numbers 14:24. It says, because Caleb had a different spirit, because my servant Caleb had a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the promised land. Now, just using that verse, we just through inference, you can say, why didn't the others make it? Caleb made it into the promised land. Why didn't all the other Israelites not make it? Why were their bodies strewn in the desert? Because they did not follow God wholeheartedly like Caleb. Caleb had a different spirit. He followed God fully, but the others did not. It was a half-hearted obedience. Sometimes they placed their faith in God. Sometimes they worship. Sometimes, so it wasn't a wholehearted faith. So the point of the author of Hebrews, or the point he's making, is that people who lack maturity and don't trust God fully will face temporal judgment and discipline. However, the author also wants the people that he is writing to know, according to verse 9, the verse that I just read, they have not yet come to this point. They are in danger of but they've not yet come to that point, because he says, he speaks of these things, but he's convinced, he says, he is sure that they are bearing fruit. There is some good work. And again, by that verse, he says, let me just read that verse, the exact verse. In verse 9, he says, though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure, we are convinced of better things, things that belong to salvation. The word belong can just as well be translated things accompanying salvation. And I think the salvation that he's talking about here in verse 9 is sanctification. You remember, even in the past, we talked about the word salvation in the Bible used in 3 different tenses. It can mean justification, can mean sanctification, it can mean glorification, can mean saved in the past, being saved according to 1 Corinthians 1:18, and it can be, according to Matthew 10:22, Jesus says, those who endure to the end will be saved. That is glorification, the final salvation. So here I think he's talking about progressive sanctification. He's not talking about justification. You say, how do you know that? Are you just guessing? No, verse 10 tells us. It says, if you just read verse 10, it says, for God is not unjust so as to overlook your work. He's not talking about justification, being saved at that point. He's not talking about the gift of salvation. He's talking about their works. He's saying, for God is not unjust so as to overlook or forget your work and the love that you have shown in his name in serving the saints. He's talking about their good work. He's talking about their fruit that they're bearing as you still do. So again, it is not to do with justification, but it is to do with their sanctification. Moving on, verses 11 and 12. And he said, here the author goes on, he says, and we desire each one of you to show the same earnestness, to have the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. When you keep pressing on in good works, in serving the Lord and serving the saints, one of the byproducts is hope. You're filled with hope. You'll be permeated with hope. And this hope that we have will prevent us from being sluggish and becoming lazy in our faith. This hope will carry us until we inherit the promises, until our faith becomes sight. It was the mid 1800s when David Livingstone, the famous missionary, had vanished into the heart of Africa. And he was driven by this conviction and this commitment that the gospel must be preached to every tribe and every tongue and every nation. And he had been gone so long that people in Britain thought that he was dead, but he was alive, barely alive, but he was alive. And he was battling malaria, he was battling loneliness, and he was in the heart of Africa. A newspaper agency sent a man called Henry Stanley to go and find David. And after a long, arduous search, after a very thorough search, he finally located this gaunt, weathered man deep in the jungle. And he even asked, are you here? He is saying, I presume that you are David. He was not sure of it because he looked so different. He was so weak at this point. And Stanley, this man who was sent from Britain, offered to take David Livingstone back home safely home, but he refused this offer. And he said he believed that God's promise to be with him had not expired, and his mission was not yet done. And David Livingstone, to cut the long story short, he died in a small hut, kneeling beside his bed in prayer. And the African believers who loved him this was after his death, they cut out his heart and they buried it beneath a tree in Africa, saying his heart belongs in Africa. Of course, his body was taken for burial back to Britain, but his heart is buried in Africa. And in one of his final letters, he wrote, I'm prepared to go anywhere provided it's forward. That's what hope looks like. That's what hope in God's promises looks like. And we must never lose hope even when a certain outcome isn't the one that we desire, because we constantly, we are hoping, we're praying for a certain outcome, and then something else happens, and then suddenly, our hope takes a beating. But we must constantly be filled with hope. Otherwise, as the author of Hebrews says, we'll become sluggish, and we know that there are many Christians who are sluggish today. So we press on to inherit God's promises through faith and through patience. Now, in the following section, in the verses that I'm going to read, the author will talk about the certainty of God's promises using Abraham as an example. In verse 13 and 14, it says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. This again brought up in verse 16 as well, but how sometimes, at least it was prevalent in my generation, I can say. I don't know about the previous generation. I don't know about Gen Z, what language they use. I know some of their terms, but I don't think they use. But when I was growing up and I was in school, if somebody did not believe what you were saying, many times people would hold their neck and they would say, mother promise. They would swear on their mother. Over here, what we read is, the question is, if God has to swear or is to make an oath, who does he swear by? I mean, who's greater than him? Why we say mother promises? Because we love our mother. Because if we say mother promise, then that person is bound to believe us, because our mother is very precious to us. Mother is very great. Those kind of things. Of course, Indian culture, it goes a lot further than that, about the respect. And some people even say we must worship your mother and all those things. But we know for a fact that when you say mother promise, it's a very great thing. So now for God, who does he swear by? How will he take an oath? And so it says here that he swore by himself, since there's nobody greater than God. So he swears by himself. Verse 15 says, and thus Abraham, having waited patiently, obtained the promise. And we know the patience in Abraham, about 25 years before God initially gave him the promise when he was about 75 years old, that I will bless you and I will multiply you. And at the age of 100, he and Sarah had Isaac. And so patience in the Christian life is something that is underrated. There's a lot of preaching that's focused today. And here's just one of the ways that we must say, you have to filter a lot of preaching that there's today. Lot of preaching today is focused on instant gratification. Lot of the preaching that you hear today. And it sounds really good in the moment when you say today, God, do it now, and all that preaches well. But when you read the Bible, there's a lot about there's also the virtue of patience. Patience is also, as that famous cliche goes, patience is a virtue, and patience, as I said, is underrated in the Christian life. It plays a very important role in the Christian life, and God would not place us in a situation where patience is required. Where patience is not beneficial. It will shape us. It purges us. And when we're patient and we're waiting on God's promises, when we receive God's promises, we'll value those promises. We'll embrace those promises. That's what patience does. That's what waiting on God does. There's a story of this boy. I don't know if I mentioned it before. He was going in the carriage, and suddenly the wagon overturned and all the corn spilled on the road. And a farmer nearby, he came to the boy And he said, "Oh, it's very unfortunate and all. Anyways, don't worry. Just forget your troubles temporarily. Come and have some dinner with us." The boy's name was Willis. He said, "Willis, come and have some dinner with us." Willis said, "I don't think my dad would like that." The farmer said, "No, no, don't worry about it. I'll help you when we after dinner. We'll put the cart the right way back, and you can continue on your journey." He was a little bit hesitant. Willis, he said, "This sounds really nice, but I really don't think that dad would like that." And then the farmer convinced him, and Willis went and he had dinner. And then after the dinner, again, Willis said, after eating and all, he said, "Again, I don't think Dad would really like that I've come and had dinner." So the farmer was a little bit irritated. He said, "Where is your dad?" And Willis said, "He's under the wagon that had overturned." So unnecessarily, this boy was too patient. He's too patient, and he didn't realize the priority, the urgency of lifting up the wagon. He just said, "I don't think Dad like that," went, had dinner, and came back. All this to say, the reason I share this story is God will never place us in a position where our patience is not producing anything. It's not just he's just doing it because we have to learn patience. That patience will always be for a purpose. There will always be a reason behind why we should learn this patience. And sometimes it's because we're going to inherit his promises, we're going to value. And also that waiting causes this deep trust, this deep dependence on God. And so sometimes he teaches us patience. And let me finish this chapter by reading verses 16 to 20. "For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes, an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." In human affairs, men will swear by somebody greater. I already touched on that, how in school we say mother promise and all that. But maybe if you go to the court of law, somebody will say that they're going to, speak the truth. They promise to speak the truth, and they may add the word, "So help me God." God will help them in speaking the truth. Or somebody might place their hand as they're taking an oath on the Bible. And all this is supposed to settle the matter. And what is expected of them at that point is that they speak 100% truth. Otherwise, I think it's called perjury. I mean, I don't know all the technical terms, but they're not expected to lie. And if they do lie, then it can be punishable by law after they've taken an oath, and they can serve time for that. And the author is saying basically that settles it. I mean, once you take that oath, it's final for confirmation, he says. And then he says, when God wanted his people to be absolutely assured that what he promised will come to pass, his promise itself, if you think about it, if God speaks, if that promise itself will suffice, that itself is enough. But he added an oath to his promise. The heirs of the promise are all those who by faith are children of Abraham. You remember that Sunday school song, Father Abraham. We're all children of Father Abraham. And the promise made to Abraham found its final fulfillment in the Lord Jesus Christ. And all the blessings, I've said this several times, it's biblical. All the blessings that belong to Jesus Christ belong to you and me so far as we are united to the Lord Jesus. And so verse 18 says the believer has two unchangeable things to rely on. Number one, his word, that is promise. Number two, his oath. He added, God speak, he can't even lie. But so when he speaks it, it's already certain, it will happen, it will come to pass. But he's added an oath to his word. And so there is nothing more certain or secure. It's impossible to think of anything more certain or secure. And in the last few verses in this chapter, the author employs four pictures or four images to drive home the utter reliability of Christian hope. The first picture is a city of refuge, you can call it, a place of refuge. Second picture is an anchor. Third picture is a forerunner, and fourth picture is a high priest. Believers flee from this place of doom, or you can call it the kingdom of darkness, into this heavenly refuge. God has given us a hope based on his word and his oath. And his hope, and we all know this picture of hope, is like an anchor. It's like an anchor. And many times hope, whenever people make a graphic or whatever, they use the picture of an anchor. And if you think about an anchor, just for a second, if you think about an anchor and you say you're on this fancy ship or you're on a cruise or something like that, and you see the anchor, and it's really beautiful. It's this massive, strong looking, high strength steel. It's still no good as long as you can see it. It's only when it's deployed into the ocean and it catches on to something that it's of use, right? So as long as you can look see the anchor, it's useless. And so basically, unless the anchor has an anchoring point, it's useless. And our anchor of hope, the hope that we're talking about here, as described here, is like an anchor. Our anchor of hope is not cast in the shifting sands of this world, but takes hold in the heavenly sanctuary behind the veil, and where Jesus has gone as our forerunner. The word translated forerunner here in verse 20 of Hebrews chapter 6 is nowhere used in the New Testament. Of course, John the Baptist is spoken of as a forerunner because of the language used to describe him, the voice crying out in the wilderness. So we say John the Baptist, forerunner of Christ. But the word that is translated forerunner in the Greek is nowhere else used except in verse 20 of Hebrews chapter 6. And when you think about the Old Testament, even the Levitical economy, the high priest was a representative. Once a year, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies. Only he was allowed to go, and some traditions say they put a rope around in case he did something wrong. They would have to drag out his dead body if he faced the wrath. Only once a year he went in as a representative. But Jesus is a forerunner, and as a forerunner, he announces our future arrival into heaven. He took possession of heavenly glories on our behalf, and he is there as a forerunner to welcome his people and present them to the Father. And he's also, the last picture is he's a high priest under the order of Melchizedek. Now, what the author is very craftily, very beautifully doing is he's bringing back a subject that he stopped in chapter 5, verse 10. He started off that subject of Jesus as a high priest under the order of Melchizedek, and then after chapter 5, verse 10, he went off into one. He took basically there was a digression where he talks about there's this warning passage, a failure to reach maturity as Christians, and we looked at that passage. Now he's picking up that subject again that he left off in chapter 5, verse 10, about Jesus being the high priest under the order of Melchizedek. And just to introduce it a little bit, basically, we read in the book of Genesis, and we've been through the 50 chapters of Genesis. There's only 3 verses about Melchizedek over there. He says, they say, is the king of Salem, king of righteousness. He comes and Abraham pays tithe to him. And just in 3 verses, his story gets over. But now we're going to study a little bit about this very enigmatic character called Melchizedek, who we are told Jesus is a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So who is he? What does he do? We'll look at it in the next study. That is who is Melchizedek and what he does. So that is Hebrews chapter 6, verses 9 to 20. Let me just maybe end with this story. Back in 1970, in Stanford University, there was an experiment that was conducted. And in that experiment, all these young children were brought into a room, and each one had to be in the room alone. And it was popularly known as the marshmallow test. Some of you probably have heard of it. Maybe you've seen some video of it. So a child was basically placed in a room, and one marshmallow was placed in front of the child, and an adult came and told the child that if you wait for 15 minutes, they gave them 2 options. You can either eat the marshmallow right now, instant gratification, or you can wait for 15 minutes. And if you wait for 15 minutes, you will receive 2 marshmallows. So the choice is yours. Now, as soon as they left the room, the adult left the room. Some of the children, they were staring at the marshmallow. Some were poking it. Some started dancing. Some started singing. Some covered their eyes so that anything to distract themselves from eating that marshmallow. And some children ate it. But there were some who waited. And those who waited got the second marshmallow after the 15 minutes. But those who also waited, interestingly, according to the study, were tracked many years later, and researchers found that the kids who waited did better at school academically. They managed stress better. They had more healthier relationships. Question is why? Because hope in a future reward changes how we live in the present. And God, if you open up the Bible, all of you know this, open up the Bible, there are so many wonderful promises that we can claim and we can hope in, and we know because of our union with Christ, the day is coming that we will inherit all these promises. And so it's really exciting. May we continue to press on, filled with hope. And now let me say it again. That is Hebrews chapter 6, verses 9 to 20.